Hi, you're listening to a student-focused episode of the Sociology Show podcast. If you're studying the subject at GCSE, A-level, foundation, degree, or any other discipline, then this podcast could be of help to you. If you have a question for the show, then you can email the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com, and one of the teachers, lecturers, examiners, or experts will answer your question for you. You can sponsor the show on the GoFundMe page and subscribe on all the usual podcast platforms. If you're going to class, going to the gym, or just chilling, put your headphones in and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to a student-focused episode of the Sociology Show podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Collins. High-quality student books, teacher guides and unbeatable value revision for GCSE and A-level sociology. And so Sociology Show listeners can get 25% off Collins Sociology resources until the end of December 2021, including the new book, How to be a Sociologist, an inspiring introduction to studying sociology at A-level and university. Simply head to collins.co.uk/sociology show and enter the code sociology show at the checkout. Terms and conditions apply. I'll give you that again. It's collins.co.uk/sociology show. And if you enter the code sociology show at the checkout, then you are entitled to 25% off Collins Sociology resources. The Sociology Show podcast is also brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is tutor2u.net/sociology, for revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so on to this episode, which is a student special episode, and it's going to focus on studies and sociologists that you can use for the topic of education. So in part one, I'm going to talk you through 6 different pieces of research, all from the 21st century, that you could use in your essays. So they're all within 21 years old. And then in part 2, I'm going to talk you through 6 of the podcasts that I've recorded with really, really important researchers and tell you the date and time that I did those. You can go back and listen to them in a little bit more detail. So without further ado, let's go over to the first piece of research that I'm going to talk about. And this one's from 2011. It's by Cofield and Williamson. And the name of the study is From Exam Factories to Communities of Discovery, the Democratic Route. Now, this piece of research looks at how education policies have led to schools and universities becoming what Cofield and Williamson call exam factories, and that further education colleges have simply become skills factories. The study suggests there should be much more focus on building communities of discovery by realizing the collective creativity of students and educators through democracy and preparation for a global world. In other words, Cofield and Williamson are really worried that the education system is just about passing exams, that we've taken away the passion and interest in working collaboratively and thinking ahead in terms of what society needs, rather than just the ability to be able to look at an exam paper and know how to pass it. What Cofield and Williamson have said is this lowers the motivation levels because teachers feel a certain amount of pressure just to get through content and not have discussions and go off the beaten track. And likewise, students just become pressured because they realize all they need to do is pass the exam and just learn information to pass that exam and then forget about it forever. It also questions how much of what we do in exams is really important for later on in life. You know, if you think about a lot of the things you do on an exam paper, they're perhaps not necessarily useful for later on in life, but it's just something you use to pass an exam, and it becomes quite a futile thing to do. So this is a really good piece of research if you want to talk about anything about criticizing the national curriculum or the structure of schools or the structure of exams. So let me give you that again. It's by Cofield and Williamson. The name of the study, From Exam Factories to Communities of Discovery, the Democratic Route, and that's from 2011. The next piece of research then, research 2, is by Hallam and Parsons, not Talcott Parsons, by the way. Okay, so don't confuse that. Hallam and Parsons, and it's called The Impact of Streaming on Attainment at Age 7. And this is from 2011. Quite often questions come up on setting or streaming, the benefits or the criticisms of such a practice. And often you have to incorporate and mix this in with something to do with research methods as well. So Hallam-Parsons research is a longitudinal study carried out on 19,000 children born around the year 2000, known as the Millennial Cohort Study. And it looks at the impact of streaming during primary school. The findings showed that the amount of progress a child makes in relation to being placed in top, middle or bottom sets is significant, especially when you compare this with children who attend schools that don't use streaming and that use a mixed ability system. Now, this is really, really important research, and it links up with quite a lot of the interactionist ideas. For those of you that remember your interactionism, you may have studied researchers such as Becker or Ray Rist or Hargreaves, any of those researchers, but this is a little bit more contemporary, and it shows that streaming can be really, really damaging. Imagine how much impact it has on a small child to tell them that they are effectively in the bottom set, how it would lower motivation levels, and even at the top sets as well, that students can become quite complacent as well. So if you do get anything to do with setting or streaming, the benefits or the weaknesses of it, or you get anything to do with labeling, anything to do with the labeling theory and the self-fulfilling prophecy, then this is a really good contemporary piece of research to use. Remember, a lot of the other research on setting, streaming and labeling is kind of 1960s, 1970s. So if you want something a little bit more contemporary, then use this research. It's Hallam and Parsons, The Impact of Streaming on Attainment at Age 7, and that's from 2011. On to research 3 then. And again, this is another piece of research from 2011. It's by Birdwell, Grist and Margot, and it's called The Forgotten Half. The forgotten half refers to those students who are interested in vocational occupations and are largely ignored by the education system, which seems to devote much of its time, energy, passion and attention to academic pupils. The study also highlights that even when schools do offer vocational courses, they are often low quality or often seen as worthless, not just by the pupils themselves, but by wider society. The focus on academia in schools rather than practical skills, according to Birdwell, Grist and Margot, leaves many teenagers underprepared for the world of work unless they are following the university route. So what the research shows is that schools are very much geared up for those students who want to get their GCSEs and go on to A-levels. And in fact, if you think about a lot of the content that you learn within schools, it's very academic based, and there's very, very little focus on the practical skills and the vocational skills that you need for the outside world. And what Birdwell, Grist and Margot are also interested in is, why is there such a lower status for that? If you are going to do something within the vocational world and you're extremely skilled in something, why does that have a lower status than going on to do an A-level in psychology and physics and chemistry, for example? And so this is, again, a really good piece of research if you've got something to do with criticising the national curriculum or what we're actually learning within schools. So let me give you that one again. That's Birdwell, Grist and Margot. It's called The Forgotten Half, and that's from 2011. So on to research 4 then, and this one takes a slightly different route. This one looks at the issue of both race and also gender. And this is by Morris and Perry. And the name of the study is Girls Behaving Badly, ? Race, Gender and Subjective Evaluation in the Discipline of African American Girls. And this is fairly recent. This is from 2017. So this is an American piece of research, and it looks at the differing punishment of students in relation to race. According to Morris and Perry, African American girls are 3 times more likely than white girls to be sent to the school office for punishment, even if it's exactly the same offence that's taken place. The research identifies not only differing reactions to behaviour in regard to ethnicity, but it also notes the way in which poor behaviour goes against the gendered expectations of femininity. So this piece of research is really useful, because if you get a question either to do with stereotyping in relation to ethnicity or to do with gender, then you can refer to this one. Now, what's really interesting is there's kind of this expectation for many African-American girls to be confrontational or to be aggressive or to talk out of turn or to not follow the rules. And Morris and Perry say that this kind of labeling or scapegoating or stereotyping influences the teacher's decision in terms of how they're going to punish the student. And what's really interesting as well is if a girl is aggressive, that it goes against that expectation of femininity. We don't expect girls to have what we we call boisterous behaviour. Even think of the word boisterous. So again, if you get something to do with gender, then this one's really useful. So another fantastic piece of research to use if you get a question on ethnicity or gender. But again, that idea of labelling, stereotyping, scapegoating, the self-fulfilling prophecy, all of those terms and questions that come up quite a lot within the education topic, then you can refer to this piece of research. So I'll give you the details again. That's Morris and Perry, Girls Behaving Badly, Race, Gender and Subjective Evaluation in the Discipline of African American Girls, and that is from 2017. On to research 5 then, and research 5 is a piece of research that I found really interesting, so much so that I actually interviewed these guys. It's from Pinkett and Roberts, and it's called Boys Don't Try, Rethinking Masculinity in Schools. And this is a book from 2019, which I picked up in Waterstones actually and read it and really enjoyed it. And so this research is conducted by an English teacher and an assistant principal, looking at the reasons behind the underperformance of boys in school and what schools can actually do to tackle this. Areas such as anxiety, bullying, self-esteem, attitudes to work, issues surrounding masculinity, and tackling poor behaviour are all considered in this book. The study not only looks at why boys may be struggling to perform to the same levels as girls in school, but also strategies that teachers can employ to tackle such concerns. Now, it's just come out recently that we are now into the 3rd decade in a row that boys are underperforming compared to girls at SATs level, at GCSE and A level. And Pinkett and Roberts say this is a problem that we can't ignore. We can't just ignore that boys are underperforming and say that it's bad behaviour and they can't be bothered and they're not trying. We actually need to look at the reasons behind why this is occurring and also try and work out what we can do to tackle it as well. And so, as I said, I also was lucky enough to interview both Pinkett and Roberts. And if you are interested in this piece of research, then please do go back and listen to the podcast. It's from April 2020. And as I said, it's a really interesting book. I'll give you those details again. They are called Pinkett and Roberts, and it's called Boys Don't Try, Rethinking Masculinity in Schools, and that's from 2019. And so on to the final piece of research. This is research 6, and this is by Ruth Payne. And Ruth Payne wrote a book in 2010 called Rewards and Sanctions in the Classroom. Now, this piece of research is also quite useful because it's very good for methods as well. So if you get something about questionnaires, this study used 3 questionnaire surveys completed by UK secondary school pupils in years 7 and year 11. The questionnaire asked pupils to state which rewards and punishments they found effective in controlling their behaviour or motivating them within schools. Now, the research showed that pupils rated missing break or detentions as not very effective. They just found it demotivating, put them off school, didn't want to be there. Whereas the research showed that stamps, merits and stickers were highly rated by students in years 7 and 8, but obviously dropped as the years went on. By the time we got to years 10 and 11, then those sort of merits or stickers didn't work quite as well. The incentive of the school trip, however, was universally rated as effective on the questionnaire among students. So a little bit more about Payne's research then. The case study was comprised of 3 questionnaire surveys completed by school pupils, as I said, in years 7 all the way up to year 11, in an attempt to identify which punishments and rewards were the most successful as a mechanism for success. Some sanctions were obviously not effective and scored very low. I've already mentioned those, something like a detention. And we also know that the most effective is something that's motivating rather than punishing as well. So I thought this was quite a good piece of research because it's a little bit different to anything else. It's a little bit unique. I've not seen any other research which is like this. And it's also one of those which is useful because it crosses the barrier of looking at methods as well. So if you're looking for something which uses a survey or a questionnaire, then this is a good one to use. So I'll give you the details again. This is Ruth Payne, Rewards and Sanctions in the Classroom, and this is from 2010. Okay, we are going to take a short break. In part 2, we are going to talk about some of the podcasts that you can listen to for the education topic.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Sociology Show podcast. We're doing a student special here talking about sociologists and studies that you can use for the topic of education. And so in part 1, I talked through 6 different studies, research that you could use. In this part, I'm going to talk about 6 episodes that I've recorded, which I think you should listen to really help you for the education topic. So the first one is an interview with Professor Diane Ray. Now, if you haven't heard of Diane Ray, what have you been doing? You've been missing out. Okay, Diane Ray, really important researcher, incredibly passionate. I love doing this interview. It's one of the most popular episodes that I've done. So I talked to Diane Ray, who's from Cambridge University, about her book, Miseducation, Inequality, Education in the Working Classes. And Diane explains about her own upbringing and route into sociology first, because that's really important. She's from a working class background and now works at Cambridge University. And then she describes the many failings and shortcomings of the English education system for working class pupils and the underprivileged. And the reason why I like this interview so much is she is so passionate. She actually goes on a huge rant about the problems of private schools and the problems of ethnicity, and also why underprivileged and working class pupils often do not perform in education. So you really should listen to this one. That's Professor Diane Ray, and that podcast is from July 2020. And so the next one that I think you should listen to marries up quite well with Diane Ray. It's someone that's worked with Diane on various different pieces of work to do with education and underprivileged in the working class. And this is Professor Nicola Ingram, and I recorded an interview with her in February 2021. And Nicola is a professor of sociology and education at Manchester Metropolitan University, and her research focuses on young people and social inequalities in education and work. She's published lots and lots of different pieces of work. Her most recent book is Working Class Boys and Educational Success, Teenage Identities, Masculinities and Urban Schooling. She's also worked on educational choices, aspirations and transitions in Europe. She's worked on higher education, social class and social mobility, the degree generation, and she's also worked on moving on up, unequal graduate labour market struggles. And so you can see that a lot of her work really ties in with Diane's work, trying to understand why there's such social class inequality within the education system. And Nicola is from Belfast in Northern Ireland, and lots of her work looks at the inequalities of the grammar school system that they have in Northern Ireland. So still there, pupils take an exam at the age of 11, and that determines whether they go to a grammar school or whether they go to a state school. And right from the age of 11, you can already see the social class inequalities, and she explains why she thinks that's such an unfair system. So if you get anything to do with social class and inequality, I would advise listening to the episodes from Professor Diane Ray and Professor Nicola Ingram. And the third podcast I think is well worth listening to is someone else who looks at widening access and inequalities within the education system. And it's Dr. Alex Blower. And I interviewed Alex in January 2021. Now, his research is about widening access to higher education, as I said. And Alex talks about his qualitative research into this important issue. And what's really interesting is Alex takes a particular focus on the issue of underperforming white working class boys. Now, the reason why I think this one's really useful is lots of questions often come up about education and ethnicity, and also about which ethnic groups underperform. And what students tend to do is they focus very heavily on black underperformance. But as you may be aware, the lowest performing group in the UK at the moment is white working class boys. And lots of students often say to me that there's a lack of research. They're not quite sure which sociologist to use for this. If they wanted to write about Asian students' high performance, or they wanted to talk about black underperformance, or anything to do with ethnic minority groups, there is often quite a lot of sociologists that you can refer to, but there's often quite a lack when referring to white students. So this is a really good researcher to use. So Dr. Alex Blower talks about the issue of white working class boys, and also why this is a much bigger societal problem, and why often when you're looking at underperformance, you can't just look at ethnicity. You have to look at the issues in an intersectional way. So please do have a listen to that one if you want some more research on the issue of ethnicity and white working class boys underperformance in particular. So that's Dr. Alex Blower, and that interview was from January 2021. Okay, and then on to the next researcher then, another person that you may have heard of. Her name appears quite a lot in the textbooks, and that's Professor Louise Archer. And I was lucky enough to interview Louise Archer in April 2020. And so Louise's work again looks at some of the issues to do with gender. And in particular, what Louise is interested in is the subjects that people go into and the subjects that they take, and particularly the STEM subjects. Now, Louise is really interested in why it's still quite a male-dominated field and what's putting off females going into those areas. Now, what she's really noticed is that often girls can perform very well in sciences. In fact, their results are often as good, if not better than boys, but they often still have a low confidence in the subject, or they don't want to take it at a higher level. For example, lots of girls do very well in sciences at GCSE, but then choose not to take it at A level. And so she's really interested in why that occurs. So if you get some questions about gender or about gender subject choice, then Professor Louise Archer is a really good, important researcher to look at. So have a listen to her episode. As I said, that's from April 2020, and she's a really important researcher that you can use and a good name to use within your essays. Okay, someone else I think you can have a listen to, and this is someone good to use if you get a question again on ethnicity, and it's Professor Louise Owusu-Kwarteng, and I was lucky enough to interview Louise back in October 2020. So Professor Owusu-Kwarteng is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Greenwich. And Louise talks in this interview about her research on ethnicity in education, and in particular the experiences of West African students. She talks about intra-racial tensions, which is really interesting, and her current research on Black identity and music. Now, the reason I think this one's really important is if you have a look in the textbooks, a lot of the discussions about Black pupils is often about Caribbean students, okay? And actually, a lot of the writing on ethnicity is also about boys, Black boys' underperformance. And Louise talks very heavily about West African students, and often the high expectations that families have on West African students and the pressure that there is to perform. So it gives a different twist perhaps to some of the names within the textbook. So another really important researcher to use if you get a question, I would say, on ethnicity, but also if you get a question about Black identity as well. So that's Professor Louise Owusu-Kwarteng, and that interview was from October 20. And then the final one that I would like you to have a listen to. Like you to have a listen to? You can have a listen to. I'm not forcing you to. But a researcher whose name does come up in your sociology textbooks quite a lot, and that is Professor Carolyn Jackson. Now, Jackson is probably best known for her research on lads and ladettes. So ladette culture in particular is really interesting piece of research. And so Carolyn Jackson is from Lancaster University. And in the episode that I recorded with her, she talks about how the lads and ladettes research came about and how she started to use the term. And then she also talks about lad culture in particular in higher education in her book, Lad Culture in Higher Education, Sexism, Sexual Harassment and Violence. And this one's really interesting as well because it's very good for the topics of problems with the boys, particularly further in higher education, and sometimes how they carry on their misogynistic values and their attitudes towards girls within higher education and so on as well. So it's quite a deep and detailed discussion, but really important. So Carolyn Jackson, if you get anything to do with gender, particularly to do with girls underperforming, certain groups of girls that underperform, certainly working class girls underperform, you can use that term ladette, but also that issue of lad culture, which is pervasive in certain aspects of higher education and onto university as well. So that's Carolyn Jackson. You can go back and listen to her episode. That is from May 2020. So there we go. I hope you found some useful information there. So studies that you can use. Maybe I've picked out some names of sociologists that you haven't yet referred to. And then also those episodes. I'm sure you've heard of the likes of Diane Ray, Nicola Ingram, Carolyn Jackson. Then please do go back and listen to those episodes in full. It should really help you out for the topic of education. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, and just a quick request. If you do listen to the episodes on Apple Podcasts, please can you give it a 5-star review? It'd be absolutely fantastic. It helps me move up the charts and mean that Sociology Show podcast is right at the top of the Sociology chart. So if you do have an opportunity to give it a 5-star review, I'd be really welcome. If you can give it a review as well, that would be fantastic. Best wishes and thank you for listening.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.